The summer of 1883 came to Copper Ridge without mercy. No rain had fallen in 3 weeks. The creek that ran along the eastern edge of Ledger Hurst's property had dropped to a thin brown trickle, barely enough to keep the horses drinking. The grass in the south pasture had gone pale and brittle, crunching underfoot like old paper. The sky, morning after morning, offered nothing but a hard, blue emptiness that pressed down on the land rather than sheltered it. Ledger noticed all of it. He had learned in the years since he left the Federal Service to watch land the way he once watched people. You could read a landscape the same way you read a face, the small signs, the details that arrived just a moment before something went wrong. That was how he noticed the horses. The first one went down on a Monday. Goliath, a 10-year-old bay with more endurance than any animal Ledger had ever owned. He found him lying on his side near the water trough before sunrise, breathing in shallow, ragged pools. By noon, the horse was dead. The second followed 2 days later. Same symptoms, same slow collapse, same quiet, bewildered dying, as though the animal could not understand what was happening to its own body. The county veterinarian came out, looked them over, and called it a stomach ailment. Bad water, maybe. Bad grass. He wrote something in his notebook, accepted $2, and rode back toward town without meeting Ledger's eyes. Ledger stood in the empty corral for a long time after the man left. He looked at the water trough. He looked at the feed bin. He looked at the ground around the fence posts where the dirt had been disturbed in a way that rain had not caused and wind could not explain. Then he looked toward the road that led back to Harrow Creek, where the veterinarian's horse was already disappearing into the heat shimmer. He did not say anything. He had learned in his years as a federal investigator and in the harder years that followed that the moment you spoke your suspicion aloud was the moment the other man knew you were watching. He went inside, sat at the table, and did the arithmetic he had been avoiding. Without those 2 horses, he could not move his cattle to the summer pasture in the hills. Without the summer pasture, the herd would overgraze the low fields by August. By October, they would be thin. By January, when the real cold arrived, a significant portion would not survive. And if the herd suffered badly enough, he would miss the bank payment in spring. And if he missed the bank payment, the land would follow. He had seen that sequence before. He had watched it happen to his father. There was a livestock auction held every other Friday at Harrow Creek, 12 miles east. Ledger had not attended one in nearly 2 years. He did not enjoy crowds, and the men who gathered at that auction yard were not the kind whose company improved his disposition. But they occasionally brought in working horses at prices a struggling man could manage, and right now, Ledger Hurst did not have the luxury of preferences. He rode into town Thursday evening and slept in the stable behind the hotel. He wanted to be there early enough to examine the animals before the bidding started, while the handlers were still leading them in and the crowd had not yet gathered into the particular mood that made men reckless with money. The auction yard sat at the south end of Main Street behind a feed store and a blacksmith shop. The wooden fence around the ring was weathered to silver gray, and the gate had a creak that carried 40 yards in the morning quiet. By 8 o'clock, the yard was half full. Men stood along the rails in clusters talking about weather and cattle prices and the new rail line that was supposed to come through the territory sometime in the next 2 years. Nobody believed it would happen, but everybody discussed it as though they did. Ledger found a place at the back rail and stayed there. Hat pulled low, hands in his pockets. He was not there to talk. The early lots were predictable. A pair of mules that went for more than they were worth because 2 men got stubborn about the bidding. A wagon with a cracked axle that nobody wanted at any price. 3 young cattle belonging to a widow in the next county who needed cash before month's end. Ledger watched all of it with the same quiet attention he gave everything, noting who was spending freely and who was holding back, which handlers were comfortable with the animals and which were being careful in a way that suggested the animals weren't safe to approach. Then the auctioneer called the next lot. 2 geldings came through the gate. They were thin, genuinely thin, the kind that came from sustained poor feeding rather than a short stretch of hard work. Their coats were dull, and their tails moved slowly at the flies without much conviction. But Ledger looked past all of that. He studied their legs. He watched the way their feet came down on the dirt. He examined their eyes, which were clear and alert, despite everything else tracking the crowd with the steady attention of animals that had not given up. He could work with that. Poor condition was something feed and rest could solve. Unsound joints or a broken spirit were something else entirely. The bidding opened at $12. A hand near the front went up, then another from the middle. The numbers climbed slowly. This was not a lot that inspired enthusiasm, and several men shook their heads and stepped back from the rail. Feed was expensive. Everyone knew it. Putting money into thin horses during a dry summer required faith in your own ability to bring them back, and not everyone possessed that faith. Ledger waited until the bidding stalled at $14.50. Then he raised his hand. 15, he said. The auctioneer pointed. 15 from the man in back. Do I hear 16 silence? A rancher near the gate spat into the dirt and walked away. Going once, going twice. The hammer came down. Ledger exhaled slowly. $15 was nearly everything he had in cash, but the horses would work given time. They had to. He was already calculating recovery timelines when the auctioneer's voice changed. The professional monotone gave way to something with a grin behind it, the kind of tone that preceded entertainment at someone else's expense. "And hell," the auctioneer said, pushing back his hat. "Take the woman, too. She comes with the lot." The yard erupted, not in surprise. In the particular laughter that men produce when they have agreed without saying so that something before them does not fully qualify as a person. It was loud and easy and entirely without hesitation, rolling across the auction yard the way it always had in places where ordinary decency seemed to stop at the gate. Ledger turned. 2 handlers were bringing something through the far end of the ring behind the horses. A woman. Her wrists were bound with thick rope, her feet bare against the dirt. Her dress was stained with dust and torn along one shoulder. Dark hair fell across her face in tangled strands. She moved without stumbling, but there was a carefulness to each step that said she had learned at some cost that falling down in front of people like this was something to be avoided. She stopped behind the horses and stood completely still with her head lowered. The auctioneer shrugged with theatrical indifference. Came in with the stock shipment from the east. No papers, no name on the manifest. Can't sell her separate from the lot. You take the horses, you take her, or you leave all 3. More laughter. A man near the front leaned to his neighbor and said something that made both of them smile. A voice from the middle called out something crude. Then from 2 rails down a voice Ledger recognized. "I'll take her." Denton Marlowe pushed away from the fence. He was a big man, thick through the chest and shoulders, with a face that had settled over the years into an expression of permanent low-level contempt for everything around him. He ran errands for men wealthier than himself, which had given him just enough authority to be dangerous without the judgment to use it carefully. Everyone in the territory knew Marlowe's name. Women seen speaking to him had a tendency to disappear from the social landscape of Harrow Creek quietly, in ways that invited no investigation, the way things disappeared when someone powerful preferred they not be mentioned. "I'll give $2 for the trouble," Marlowe said. The laughter shifted register quieter, uglier, the sound of men settling into something they knew they probably shouldn't enjoy. Ledger was looking at the woman. She had not moved since she stopped behind the horses. Head still lowered, arms at her sides. She looked like a person who had made a decision not to disappear into the situation, not to become invisible the way people sometimes did when truly broken, but to become very still and very watchful, and wait for the moment that mattered. Her hands confirmed it. They were not hanging loose at the rope's end, not clenched in fear or anger. They were positioned deliberately, fingers curled slightly inward, as though she was preventing herself from doing something with them. Managing herself rather than simply enduring. And her hands were wrong for what was being implied about her. Long fingers precise. Ink stains on the inside of her right index finger worked into the skin permanently from years of sustained use. The callus on the heel of her right hand, just below the little finger, was the kind built from pressing a pen against paper over a long career. These were not the hands of a woman without history or purpose. Ledger stepped forward from the back rail. "Untie her." He said it at normal volume, in a flat, even tone, a man stating a fact rather than making a request. The words carried in the near silence that followed, and the yard went quiet enough that the gate's creak behind him seemed loud. Marlowe turned and looked at him. 30 feet of ring between them. "Now, hold on," Marlowe said. Ledger did not respond to that. He looked at the auctioneer and waited. The auctioneer looked between the two men with the expression of someone calculating costs. Then he made a small gesture to a boy standing near the gate, who came forward with a pocket knife and sliced through the binding on the woman's wrists. The rope fell to the ground. For a moment, she swayed very slightly. The smallest adjustment of balance from someone whose circulation had been restricted longer than was comfortable. Then one hand came up and took hold of the mane of the nearest horse with a grip that was immediate and sure, steadying herself without drama or acknowledgement that she had needed to. Marlowe's expression went flat. "You're making a mistake, Kane," he said, using the wrong name either by error or by intent. Ledger wasn't certain, and it didn't particularly matter. Ledger took the lead rope of the nearest horse and turned toward the gate. Behind him, after a pause of perhaps 3 seconds, he heard the sound of bare feet on packed dirt. They walked out through the gate and into the street. The noise of the auction yard faded behind them, replaced by the ordinary sounds of a Thursday town, a wagon to the north, hammering from the blacksmith shop, a dog barking once and stopping. The summer heat pressed down without apology. Ledger walked. The 2 horses followed on the lead rope, and 6 feet behind the horses the woman walked without speaking. After a quarter mile, Ledger stopped and turned around. She stood 6 feet back, head slightly lowered, arms at her sides. "Waiting." "You don't have to follow me," Ledger said. She said nothing. "I didn't buy you. I bought 2 horses." Still nothing. He studied her the way he had studied the horses, practically looking past the obvious to the details that told the real story. Her feet were cut from the walk through town, but she was standing on them without favoring either one, which meant the pain was manageable and she was managing it. Her dress had been well made before it was ruined. The stitching was fine. The fabric had been quality. The ink stain on her finger was old enough to be permanent. The specific callus on her right hand was from years at a writing desk. "Can you speak?" he asked. She looked up at him. Her eyes were dark and entirely steady, the eyes of a person doing careful arithmetic. Then she looked down again. Ledger exhaled through his nose. "All right," he said. "I've got a ranch about 4 hours east. You can stay the night, eat something. Tomorrow, you go wherever you need to go." She followed him. Not close, not far. Just present, like a second shadow that had decided to attach itself without asking permission. The road back to Copper Ridge wound through dry summer hills that the afternoon sun turned the color of old bronze. The grass stood still in breathless heat. Ledger did not try conversation. He had lived alone for 4 years and had largely lost the habit. The horses walked steadily. The woman walked steadily behind them, and the miles passed in a silence that was not comfortable but was at least honest. He noticed things about her without meaning to. She did not ask to stop, though the road was rough and her feet were bare. She did not slow when the grade increased on the hill climb 2 hours out. When a rattlesnake moved across the road ahead of them and both horses shied, she steadied her side of the situation before Ledger could react. Not by grabbing at the animals, but by going very still in a way that communicated itself to them. The horses settled. By the time the ranch came into view, he had revised his initial assessment of her 3 times. The ranch was not impressive from the outside. A house, a corral, a barn, with a slight list to the left that Ledger had been meaning to correct for 2 years. The fences were functional but not beautiful. The yard was swept and the tools properly stored, which said something about the man who lived there, even if the structures said something else. Ledger led the horses to the water trough and pointed toward the bunkhouse. "Water's in the barrel by the door," he said. "Stove's inside. Wood's stacked on the east wall." She walked past him, stepped into the bunkhouse, and pulled the door closed behind her. Ledger stood in the yard, looking at the closed door for a moment. Then he went into the house and put together a plate of bread beans and dried beef. He carried it to the bunkhouse and knocked once. "Food's here." No reply. He left the plate on the step and went back inside. He sat at his kitchen table and tried to eat his own supper and found he was not hungry. He kept returning to the same details: the rope Marlowe's eyes, the quality of her dress, the ink on her finger, the way she had gripped the horse's mane with the practiced steadiness of someone accustomed to assessing situations and responding with minimum necessary force. He was still sitting at the table when a knock came at the door. He opened it. She stood on the step holding the empty plate. Every scrap of food was gone. She held the plate toward him with both hands, the way you returned something that belonged to someone else. He took it. "Thank you," he said quietly. She nodded once and turned back toward the bunkhouse. He washed the plate slowly and went to bed, and did not sleep well, which he had not expected to. He was awake before sunrise, dressed in the dark, and when he stepped outside into the cool gray of early morning, he stopped on the porch. The bunkhouse door stood open. She was crouched beside the corral fence on the south side, where 2 boards had been loose since spring. She had found his hammer. It had been hanging on a nail inside the barn, and she was working methodically along the fence line, testing each board, finding the ones that needed attention, driving nails with strokes that were careful and precise and completely unhurried. She had found his spare work boots inside the barn door. They were 2 sizes too large for her, but she had laced them tight enough to stay on. Ledger crossed the yard toward her. "You don't have to do that." She drove 1 more nail, tested the board with both hands, set the hammer down on the fence post, and straightened to face him. "The bottom hinge on your barn door is rusted through," she said. "It will fail within the week." Her voice was even and educated, with a precision of diction that belonged to someone taught to speak carefully, and who had continued by practice and preference. It landed with enough force that Ledger stood without responding for a moment. "You talk," he said. "Yes. They said you couldn't." Something shifted in her eyes, not quite amusement, not quite contempt. "A woman who cannot speak is invisible," she said. "And invisible people survive." Ledger absorbed that. He looked at her with the careful attention he had been giving her since the auction yard, and asked what the attention had been building toward. "What's your name?" She met his gaze without hesitation. "Wren Voss, Ledger Hurst." Something moved at the corner of her mouth, not a smile, but the distant possibility of one observed and then set aside. The silence between them was different from the silence of the previous day. Less guarded. The silence of 2 people who have established without discussion that they are actually talking now. "You noticed my hands at the auction," Wren said. It was not a question. "I noticed several things," Ledger said. She looked at her hands briefly, then back at him. "I spent 9 years managing internal records for Crane Land and Rail." She said the name the way you said the name of a disease accurately, without particular emotion. "Survey documents, acquisition files, correspondence with territorial officials, payment records for operations that were never intended to appear in any official accounting." Ledger went still. Edmund Crane. She continued controlled more land in this territory than any private entity had legal right to control. He achieved this through falsified survey markers, debt instruments with conditions buried in fine print, strategic pressure on bank officers, and in cases where those approaches proved insufficient, she paused other methods. Ledger's voice came out quieter than he intended. Such as introducing a substance into the water supply of a livestock operation that produced symptoms consistent with natural illness. The animals would decline over days. The rancher would call a veterinarian. The veterinarian, if he was the right veterinarian, would record a natural cause of death. The rancher, unable to service his debt without the livestock, would default. Crane would acquire the property through the bank, which he largely controlled at a fraction of its value. The morning was very quiet around them. "Your 2 horses," Wren said carefully, "did not die of natural causes. I know this because I read the order authorizing it." Ledger looked at her for a long time. "There was a ranch," she continued. "Copper Ridge, a man named James Hurst, winter of 1878. Something happened in Ledger's chest, a slow tightening, followed by a controlled expansion, the physical response to something half-suspected for years arriving as confirmed fact. "That was my father," he said. "I know." She held his gaze without flinching. He didn't fail. He was robbed. The word arrived with the quiet authority of a legal document, formal, precise, and final in a way that ordinary words rarely managed. Ledger looked away from her. He looked out over the dry grass and the pale hills and the sky beginning to lighten at the eastern edge. He looked at the corral fence she had been repairing before the sun came up. He stood there for what might have been 2 minutes or 5. The grief he thought he had finished with turned out to have been waiting, not finished at all, only stored somewhere he hadn't looked recently. Then he turned and walked into the house. When he came back out, he was carrying a folded map. He spread it on the fence post between them. "Helena," he said. "The Territorial Records Office. Federal jurisdiction." She looked at the map. "If we enter documented testimony into the federal record, and if the physical evidence I placed in 3 separate locations is still intact, then Crane cannot suppress it through the channels he normally uses. The federal court falls outside his reach." Ledger looked up. "Physical evidence. For 3 years, she said, I copied every significant document I handled. Survey records, payment schedules, correspondence with territorial officials. I sent the copies in sealed envelopes to 3 locations, people who would hold them without knowing what they contained. A federal post office in Denver, a law office in Cheyenne, and a Methodist church not 2 miles from where we are standing." She said it without drama, the way you stated a fact that had been true for a while and would remain true regardless of how anyone felt about it. Ledger studied her. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because Wren said when my father discovered what I had been doing, he did not kill me. He sold me into an auction yard with the livestock. He needed me to disappear without a body, because a body invites questions, and questions are the one thing Edmund Crane has never been able to control." She met his gaze directly. "He sent men to kill your horses last week. Not because your ranch was a priority target, because you were a federal investigator who left the service under unusual circumstances in 1879, the same year your father lost this land. In Crane's experience, former federal investigators with personal reasons to look in his direction are cheaper to eliminate early than to manage later. He wanted you broke and distracted before you had time to start asking questions. The morning light was coming in full now, burning the tops of the eastern hills gold." Ledger stood with both hands on the fence post, looking at the map. He was running the arithmetic again, not of feed costs and herd numbers, but of distances, timelines, and the particular mathematics of a situation that had been building for 5 years without his knowledge. He looked up. "How long to Helena, avoiding the main road?" Wren considered. 4 days through the Bitterstone Pass. 3 if you know the North Canyon cutoff." Ledger looked at her steadily. "I know the North Canyon. I rode it 6 times when I was in the service." Something shifted in her expression, genuine and unguarded, just for a moment. "Then you are not only a cattle rancher," she said. "Not originally," Ledger said. He folded the map with the practiced efficiency of a man who had folded maps in the field under conditions that did not encourage careful handling. He looked at the barn, the horses in the corral, the fences that would have to wait. "One thing," he said. "From this point forward, if you see or hear something that concerns you, you tell me immediately. No more waiting to see if I'm worth trusting. We don't have time for that." She looked at him for a moment with those steady, measuring eyes. "Then, the men who were watching us from the ridge east of town this morning, there were 2 of them. They stayed back when we turned onto the road. They did not follow us out." Ledger kept his expression neutral. "How do you know they were following us, and not simply traveling the same direction?" "Because Wren said they were the same 2 men who loaded me onto the stock wagon 3 days ago in Grand Junction." She paused. "And they did not look at the horses once." Ledger nodded slowly. "Crane knew you'd be brought to Harrow Creek," he said. "And when Marlowe saw what happened at the auction, he sent word immediately." "Within the hour," Wren confirmed. But Crane won't move against us at the ranch tonight. He'll want to know which direction we travel before he positions men to intercept. Acting at the ranch creates a scene that draws attention. He prefers to manage things in open country away from witnesses. She said it with the matter-of-fact clarity of someone who had spent years reading the operational logic of a criminal mind from the inside. "We leave before sunrise," Ledger said. "Pack only what you can carry at a run." She nodded once and turned back toward the bunkhouse. "We leave before sunrise," Ledger said again to himself, this time looking out over the dry hills. He was already thinking about the North Canyon, about water sources, about the gap between their departure and Crane's response time. He went inside to prepare. They left before the sky showed any color. Ledger had the horses saddled and the supplies divided between 2 saddlebags before Wren emerged from the bunkhouse. She was carrying nothing except what she wore, the same dress brushed as clean as it was going to get, with the oversized work boots laced tight. She had found a length of cord and used it to tie her hair back. She looked like someone who had decided the situation required complete practicality and had acted on that decision without needing to discuss it. Ledger handed her a canvas coat from the hook inside the barn door. Nights in the pass get cold even in June. She took it without argument. He had packed food for 6 days more than the 4 they needed, because in his experience as a federal investigator, the difference between a plan and a situation was usually about 2 days. He had packed ammunition, a medical kit, 2 canteens, and a length of rope. He had left a note under a coffee tin on his kitchen table for his neighbor, Aldous Pruitt, who checked on the property twice a week, telling him to feed the cattle from the South Bin and not to discuss Ledger's whereabouts with anyone from Harrow Creek. He had thought about what else to leave and decided that was enough. They rode out through the east gate in the pre-dawn gray, moving at a walk to avoid raising dust. Ledger took them north first along the dry creek bed, then cut east through a narrow draw that most people in the county did not know existed. He had found it in the winter of 1879 when he was new to this land, and still learning it the way he had learned territories before, systematically on foot, until the geography was as familiar as the inside of his own house. Wren rode without difficulty. She did not grip the saddle horn or hold the reins too tight. She moved with the horse rather than against it, adjusting her weight on turns with the unconscious ease of someone who had ridden regularly at some earlier point in her life. Ledger noted this and filed it without comment. For the first 2 hours, neither of them spoke. The land moved past in early morning, quiet, pale grass, dark rock, the occasional cottonwood standing alone in a dry wash. The sky went from black to gray to a thin, reluctant blue. The sun arrived without ceremony, just a sudden brightening along the eastern ridge. Ledger was watching the high ground to their right when Wren spoke. 2 riders on the ridge. He did not look immediately. He let 3 strides pass, then turned his head as though checking the terrain ahead, rotating his gaze naturally across the landscape until he found what she described. 2 shapes on the skyline moving parallel to their direction, maintaining distance. "How long?" he said. "Since we crossed the creek bed. They picked us up when we turned east." He absorbed this without changing pace or expression. That was 40 minutes back, which meant they had been watching the ranch overnight, not following from town. Positioned before dawn, which meant Crane had not waited to learn their direction before deploying men. He had assumed Helena and sent people ahead to confirm. He ran the terrain options. The Bitterstone Pass was 3 hours north. If the Ridge Riders maintained their parallel course, they would hold the high ground through the entire approach, not a position he wanted to spend 3 hours in, but a narrow ravine cut through the eastern foothills about a mile ahead, too rough for easy riding but navigable if you knew the entry point. He had used it twice in his investigating years to move without being visible from above. "We change course in about a mile," he said quietly. "Ravine to the east. Rough going, but it takes us off the skyline and under cover. The riders above won't risk their horses on that descent." Wren considered the information. "And after the ravine, we come out on the far side of the first ridge and pick up the North Canyon Trail. Adds 2 hours to the day, but puts us in terrain where 2 men on a parallel ridge cannot follow without coming down to our level. And if they come down to our level, then we deal with that," Ledger said. She was quiet for a moment. "They are local contractors," she said. not trained investigators. They will watch and report or intercept if we stop, but they are not comfortable initiating confrontation with an armed man in open country. Crane uses men like that for low-risk surveillance. He reserves his more capable people for operations requiring a higher certainty of outcome, meaning Fletcher Dodd handles the actual interception. Yes. She said it without emphasis. Dodd will be positioned somewhere on the Helena approach with documentation sufficient to arrest me. He carries a federal marshal's commission that Crane arranged through a contact in the territorial administration in 1880. Ledger looked ahead at the ravine entrance, now perhaps half a mile away. And a federal marshal's authority supersedes a private citizen's objection. Yes. So when we reach him, legal argument is not our primary resource, No Wren said. Speed is. They reached the ravine entrance before 9 in the morning. Ledger took them in at an angle that minimized the transition from open ground to enclosed terrain. Entering a ravine in a hurry announced itself to anyone watching from above. The horses picked their way down loose rock, carefully feeling each step before committing weight. Wren let her horse make its own decisions on the descent, which was the correct approach on uncertain footing, and it confirmed what Ledger had already concluded about her ability to ride. Below the rim, the world closed in. The ravine walls rose 20 feet on either side, close enough that the sound of hooves bounced back at them in a way that took some adjusting to. The footing was rocky and required concentration. They moved single file, Ledger ahead at a pace faster than a walk, but not fast enough to risk a horse's leg. The riders on the ridge did not follow them down. They emerged an hour later, horses blowing but sound, into a shallow valley, running north through pine and juniper. The high ground behind them was empty. Ahead, the North Canyon Trail climbed through rock toward the pass. Ledger stopped to water the horses at a small spring near the valley floor. Wren dismounted and crouched beside the water, drinking from cupped hands. Ledger checked both horses' legs and found nothing concerning, then filled the canteens. "They found us before dawn," he said. "Before we left the ranch." "Yes, which means Crane didn't wait to learn our direction. He assumed Helena and moved immediately. He always assumes the worst-case scenario for his interests and acts on that assumption," Wren said. "It is what makes him effective." She stood and wiped her hands on the canvas coat. She was scanning the valley walls with the attention of someone taking careful inventory. He will have sent a second communication to Fletcher Dodd last night when Marlowe reported what happened at the auction. Dodd will be positioned to intercept somewhere on the Helena Road before we arrive. Ledger checked the sun's position. "We have maybe a day and a half before we reach that road. Then we have a day and a half to think about it," she said. They made good time through the morning. The North Canyon Trail climbed steadily into pine forest that kept them shaded and largely invisible from above. Ledger set a pace sustainable over distance, not fast enough to tire the horses, but not slow enough to feel like safety. There was no safety in this stretch of country right now. There was only progress measured in miles. Around midday, Wren spoke again. "The letter my father sent authorizing the treatment of your horses," she said, "was filed under a subsidiary company name. Western Territory Livestock Consulting. That was standard practice. Direct correspondence was never used. Everything passed through one of 11 shell companies maintained specifically to insulate his personal signature from operational decisions." Ledger kept his eyes on the trail. "But you have copies of the connection between the shell companies and the parent accounts." "I have ledger entries connecting each subsidiary to the parent and 3 letters, where the operational language is specific enough that a competent federal auditor could reconstruct the entire chain." She paused. "Judge Orrin Sable in Helena has turned down 2 appointments to higher courts rather than relocate from the territory, which suggests a specific investment in territorial jurisdiction. He ruled against a Crane subsidiary in a property dispute in 1881, and the ruling held on appeal." "You've been planning this for a long time," Ledger said. 3 years, she said simply. He thought about what those 3 years meant, reading, memorizing, understanding the full architecture of a criminal enterprise from the inside, sending sealed envelopes to strangers, giving no outward indication that any of it was being retained or prepared. The discipline required was not ordinary. The patience was something else. How old were you when you started working for your father? He asked. 19, she said. My mother died that spring. Fever. 4 days. And then she was gone. My father brought me into the office work within a month. He believed family members were more reliable than hired staff for sensitive records. She was quiet for a moment. He was correct. He was simply wrong about the direction the reliability would run. They camped the first night in a hollow below the canyon rim under a stand of pines that blocked the wind from the north. No fire ledger made that decision without discussion, and Wren accepted it without comment. They ate cold bread and dried beef and drank from the canteens sitting on opposite sides of a flat rock that served as a table. The stars came out above the canyon walls in the density that only appeared at altitude away from town light. Ledger sat with his rifle across his knees and watched the rim. Wren sat with her back against a pine and ate methodically. After a while, she said, "Tell me about your father." It was a direct question simply asked, and in the dark and quiet it landed differently than it might have in daylight. James Hurst Ledger said, "Built that ranch from raw land, started with 40 acres and a cabin that was barely walls and a roof. Expanded over 20 years by doing the work himself and keeping his accounts straight. He said if you kept your accounts straight, everything else followed." He looked at the rim above them. When the cattle died and the bank called the debt, he didn't fight it. He believed he had failed, that he had made some error in management he couldn't identify, and the consequence was just. He spent the last 3 years of his life trying to figure out what he had done wrong so he could explain it to me. The pine trees moved in a wind that came down off the canyon wall and then was gone. He never figured it out, Ledger said, because there was nothing to figure out. The failure wasn't in his accounts or his management or his judgment. It was arranged from the outside by a man who had never set foot on that land and wouldn't have known how to build what my father built. He shook his head once a small, contained motion. He apologized to me before he died, for leaving me less than he intended to. He didn't owe me any apology. He never did anything that required one. But he died believing he did, and there was nothing I could do about that by the time I understood it clearly enough to say so. Wren was quiet for a long moment. My mother died when I was 12, she said. Fever in the spring. She was gone in 4 days. She said it without asking for anything in return, just placing it there in the dark as a fact that belonged to the conversation. My father did not grieve, or perhaps he did in ways I was too young to recognize. What I observed was that within a month of her death, he had arranged for me to begin office work. The lessons started immediately. Handwriting, filing systems, correspondence protocols, how to read a contract for the clause that changes everything. She looked up at the stars. I was good at it, better than the men he employed. He told me once that I had a gift for pattern recognition for seeing the shape of a thing before all its parts were visible. She turned the empty tin cup in her hands. He meant it as a compliment. I believe it was accurate. I simply applied the pattern recognition to him eventually and saw the shape of what he was doing before I had documented all of it. Ledger looked at her across the flat rock. When did you decide? 1880, she said. There was a family in Lincoln County, a husband and wife, and 3 children who lost their homestead. The method was the standard one. The husband had borrowed against the property. The terms contained an acceleration clause, and the conditions triggering that clause were quietly arranged. The family was given 30 days to vacate. She stopped. I processed that paperwork, she said. I filed it correctly and completely. Then I went home and sat in my room for a long time. And I decided that the correct application of pattern recognition was to build a record that would outlast my father's ability to suppress it. Ledger nodded slowly. 3 years of preparation. And then he found out. 3 weeks ago, she said. He found a draft of one of the letters I had been preparing to send to Cheyenne. I had been careless, I was tired, and I left it in a desk drawer, other than destroying it as I should have. He came to me that evening, and he was very calm, which is how I knew it was serious. Edmund Crane's anger is not loud. It is administrative. She set the tin cup down. He told me he was going to send me east to family in Ohio for an indefinite period. He said it in the same tone he used to discuss the quarterly land assessments. I knew what it meant. There is no family in Ohio. Ledger said. And instead, 3 days later, 2 men came to my room at night and put me in a wagon. It took a week to reach Harrow Creek, moving through back routes. When they unloaded me at the auction yard, I believe the instruction was to ensure I was taken by someone who would keep me occupied and out of reach long enough for my father to complete the legal processes that would discredit anything I might say. She looked at him steadily. What they did not account for, she said, was that the man who stepped forward at that auction happened to be the son of James Hurst. Ledger held her gaze. No, they didn't account for that. They slept in shifts that night. Ledger took the first watch, and Wren slept against the pine tree with the canvas coat pulled around her, and she was asleep within 2 minutes, the sleep of someone who had learned to take rest when available rather than when comfortable. At 2 in the morning, she woke without being called, sat up and said, "Go to sleep. I'll watch until dawn." He handed her the rifle without argument and went to sleep against his saddle. The second day was harder. The North Canyon Trail climbed into open rock, where the footing was loose and the summer sun came at them from 2 directions directly from the east and reflected off white limestone canyon walls. There was no shade and no water until late afternoon when they found a seep in the rock that gave them enough to fill the canteens and give the horses a drink that was less than what they needed, but better than nothing. In the late afternoon, with the shadows beginning to extend from the western walls, Wren said, "There is something else about your father that you should know." Ledger looked at her. "The veterinarian who came to your property in 1878, she said. "The one who recorded a natural cause of death for your father's cattle. His name is in the correspondence under Western Territory Livestock Consulting. He received a payment of $40 in January of 1879 for what was recorded as livestock consulting services." Ledger said nothing. "But there is also a second entry," she said, her voice careful now, measuring each word. "From December of 1878, a payment of $20 to the same name categorized as a property assessment consultation in Copper Ridge." He heard what she was saying before she finished saying it. "December 1878, he said. "Yes. My father died in December 1878. "Yes. The official cause of death was recorded as heart failure," Ledger said. "The attending was the county veterinarian who was the only man with medical training who came to the property in his final days." Wren held his gaze. "I cannot tell you with certainty what happened," she said. "I can tell you what the documents suggest. And I can tell you that if Judge Sable determines an investigation is warranted, the determination of certainty belongs to the legal process, not to what you or I can establish alone." She paused. "I wanted you to know before we arrived, so you would not learn it in a courtroom." Ledger looked away from her. He looked at the hawk circling above the south rim, riding a thermal invisible from below. He had believed in the years since his father's death that he had made peace with it, with the disease and the debt and the death that followed in gray progression over those winter weeks. He had told himself that the grief was behind him and the anger was behind him, and what remained was the work of building something new on what was left. He had been wrong about that. He understood it now with the clarity that only arrives when something you thought was settled reveals itself to have been waiting. He picked up his reins. "We push through tonight," he said. "I want to be within 2 hours of Helena by morning." Wren said, "All right." They rode through the long evening and into full dark, and Ledger did not speak, and Wren did not require him to, and the stars wheeled overhead, and the horses moved steadily north, and the miles accumulated in a silence that had weight to it. Now, not the cautious silence of 2 strangers, but the heavier silence of 2 people who are carrying the same thing from different directions. They made camp briefly before midnight. Not a real camp, just an hour of rest for the horses, during which neither of them truly slept, and then rode again until the first gray of pre-dawn began separating the sky from the ridge line to the east. They were 4 miles from Helena when Dodd found them. The morning was flat and gray, the road into the capital just beginning to show the first traces of traffic dust from early freight wagons. Ledger had pushed them through most of the night, and the horses were tired, and he was tired, and Wren was riding with the controlled stillness of someone managing exhaustion through will alone. He saw the riders before Dodd called out. 3 men on horseback positioned at a natural choke point where the trail narrowed between a rock face and a drop-off to the east. A marshal's badge caught the flat morning light. The middle rider was larger than the other 2, sitting his horse, with the settled weight of a man who had been waiting long enough to be entirely comfortable about it. Dodd called out at 50 yards. His voice carried the easy authority of a man who had learned that tone was half of any confrontation. Well now, he drew it out slowly. Miss Voss. Wren did not answer. Dodd's eyes moved to Ledger. And you'd be Hurst. Ledger said nothing. Dodd reached inside his coat and produced a folded document. Got a lawful warrant here, he said. Detainment and return of one Wren Voss, charges of theft of commercial records and breach of fiduciary duty to Crane Land and Rail Corporation. He held it up briefly, then returned it to his coat. You're harboring a fugitive Hurst. Federal offense. Let me see the warrant, Ledger said. I'm a United States Marshal. You don't need to. That ain't what I asked, Ledger said. The easy tone flattened. To Dodd's right, one of his men shifted in the saddle. Ledger cut his eyes briefly to Wren. She had already assessed the situation. The drop-off to the east eliminated that direction, but there was a gap on the left side of the road between Dodd and his leftmost rider, tight but passable for a horse that moved without hesitation. She met his eyes. He gave the smallest possible nod. Dodd was saying something about territorial authority when Ledger kicked his horse forward hard and directly straight at the gap between Dodd and his left rider. The sudden movement startled Dodd's animal sideways, breaking the 3 men's tight positioning for 2 critical seconds. Go, Ledger said. Wren's horse was already moving. She took the gap at a full gallop before Dodd's men could close it, and the sound of her horse on the road accelerated and then began to diminish as she put distance between herself and the choke point. One of Dodd's men wheeled to follow, and Ledger cut across his path at close quarters, forcing another shying and costing another 4 seconds. Dodd brought his horse around and faced Ledger directly in the middle of the road. Move, Dodd said. Ledger held his position. Behind Dodd, to the north, the sound of Wren's horse was fading. Shoot me in front of the whole road, Ledger said steadily. Let's see how that sits with a federal judge. Dodd's jaw tightened. He lifted his pistol. You're making a mistake, Dodd said. I've made worse, Ledger said. The pistol came down in a fast arc, and the metal connected with the left side of Ledger's face with force that sent white across his vision. He grabbed the saddle horn and stayed on. Dodd struck him a second time higher, catching his temple, and Ledger felt himself list to one side with the specific distant awareness of a body doing something its owner has not authorized. He straightened by will and held the road. You think you're a hero? Dodd said quietly. Ledger tasted blood. He had a clear count in his head of how many seconds Wren needed and how many he had already purchased. My father lost his land to your employer, he said. His voice came out even. Dodd said nothing. And your employer sent a man to that property in December of 1878, Ledger said. Paid him $20 from a subsidiary account for a service that was never recorded as livestock work. Something moved behind Dodd's eyes. Not guilt. The rapid recalculation of a man discovering a variable he thought he'd accounted for is larger than he estimated. Ledger leaned forward slightly. And right now, Crane's daughter is riding into Helena with every record he ever kept and every name he ever paid. Dodd held very still for a moment. Then he turned sharply. Ride! The 3 men thundered north toward Helena. Ledger stayed where he was in the empty road, barely upright in the saddle. Blood was running along his jaw and dripping into the dust below his horse's feet. He gave himself 30 seconds, counted them deliberately. Then he turned his horse north and rode. The road into Helena was wider than the trails they had been riding for 4 days, and the difference felt wrong to Ledger. Too open, too smooth, too many angles from which to be observed. He rode at a walk because that was all his horse had left, and because his body had developed specific opinions about faster movement that he was overriding through will rather than genuine capacity. The left side of his face had swollen significantly in the hour since Dodd's pistol had connected with it. His vision on that side had taken on a narrowed quality he did not find reassuring. His shirt was dark with blood along the collar. He had used his bandana to apply pressure during the first mile, then tied it around his jaw in an arrangement that was functional, if not dignified. He did the arithmetic as he rode. Wren had a 2-minute head start on Dodd and his men. Dodd's horses were fresher. The road from the choke point to Helena's center was approximately 4 miles. On a tired horse, Wren would need roughly 12 minutes. Dodd would close to perhaps 30 seconds by the time they reached the edge of town. 30 seconds between a woman and 3 men with federal authority in an open street. It was not a comfortable number. But Ledger had learned over years of moving people toward outcomes he could not directly control, that there was always a point where you had done what you could do, and the result was no longer yours to determine. You accepted that point, or you didn't. Accepting it didn't change it, but fighting it wasted the energy you needed for what came next. He kept riding north. A deputy found him a mile outside town. A young man on a gray horse, badge, visible hand, nowhere near his weapon, which Ledger took as a reasonable opening indicator. "You Hurst," the deputy said. Ledger confirmed that he was. "Judge Sable sent me out. Woman at the courthouse said you'd be coming from the south. Said to look for a man on a gray roan who looked like he'd recently lost an argument." Ledger allowed that this was accurate. The deputy turned and rode alongside him without further questions, which Ledger appreciated. Some men understood that there were moments when questions were a courtesy best declined, and this one appeared to be among them. Helena was fully awake by the time they reached the main street, the working hour when the sidewalks carried the particular traffic of a territorial capital. Clerks and officials, and landowners and lawyers, all moving with the purposeful briskness of people who had appointments and the self-regard of people who considered their appointments important. They parted for Ledger and the deputy with the instinctive deference that men on horseback received in western streets, and nobody remarked on the blood, though several people looked. The federal courthouse stood at the north end of the main street, a 2-story stone building constructed with more permanence than its neighbors, as though the territorial government had decided that at least one building in Helena should look like it intended to be standing in 50 years. The flag above the entrance moved in a light wind off the mountains. On the courthouse steps, Wren Voss was waiting. She was standing at the top of the steps with her arms at her sides and the canvas coat over one arm. And when she saw Ledger, she came down 3 steps quickly and stopped. She looked at his face for a long moment with an expression that was the closest he had seen her come to something unguarded and unmanaged. "You look terrible," she said. "You should see the other man," Ledger said. He dismounted carefully and handed the reins to the deputy. Wren did not reach for him or offer an arm. She had understood in 4 days of riding together that he would not want that on the steps of a federal courthouse in front of a main street full of people. Instead, she walked beside him up the steps and through the door, close enough that he could have steadied himself against her if he had needed to. Inside the building was cool and smelled of paper and wood polish. A clerk at a desk near the entrance looked up, assessed the situation with one glance, and went immediately to a back hallway. He returned with a doctor carrying a black bag. The doctor worked on Ledger's face in a side room while Wren stood near the door and provided information to the clerk in a low, steady voice, names, dates, the locations of the 3 document caches, the specific federal statutes under which she believed jurisdiction was established. She spoke without notes and without hesitation. The clerk wrote everything down with the focused speed of a man who understood that what he was recording mattered considerably. The doctor cleaned the wounds, applied pressure, and told Ledger that the cheekbone appeared intact, but the swelling would be significant for several days and that he should rest. Ledger thanked him and stood up from the chair before the recommendation was fully delivered. At the end of the main hall, the door to Judge Orrin Sable's chambers was plain and well fitted, with a brass plate polished recently enough to still show cloth marks. Ledger straightened his shirt with both hands, a limited improvement given the shirt's condition, and knocked. "Come in." Judge Orrin Sable was 58 years old and looked like a man who had spent those years doing work that required sustained concentration under difficult circumstances. He was not large, but he occupied his chair with the settled authority of someone who had been in it a long time and had no uncertainty about his right to be there. His hair was grey, and his eyes were the pale blue of water at significant depth, clear cold, and considerably more present than comfortable. He looked at Ledger, he looked at Wren, he looked at Ledger's face. "Sit down," he said. They sat. Sable folded his hands on the desk. "Miss Voss." He said it with the neutrality of a man who had heard many names and reserved his assessments of the people attached to them until he had sufficient basis. "I have been reading the preliminary testimony my clerk has recorded over the past hour." He paused. "I have also received a petition from the Territorial Governor's Office, filed approximately 40 minutes ago, requesting that I decline jurisdiction in this matter, on the grounds that it is commercial rather than criminal." Wren said nothing. She watched Sable with her standard inventory taking attention. "The timing of that petition," Sable continued, "is either a remarkable coincidence or an indication that Mr. Crane possesses a reliable source of information about events that have not yet formally entered the public record." He looked at them both. "I mention this because I want you to understand that I am aware of the context in which this testimony is being offered, and that I do not intend to be managed by that context." He unfolded his hands. "I have dispatched riders to 3 locations," he said. "The Federal Post Office in Denver, a law office in Cheyenne registered to an attorney named Gideon Farr, and the Methodist Church on the Harrow Creek Road, whose pastor is a Reverend Elias Wode." He looked at Wren. "Those are the locations you specified in your preliminary statement." "Yes," Wren said. "The riders will return within 2 days. If the materials are where you say they are, and contain what you say they contain, this matter will proceed under federal jurisdiction and the governor's petition will be declined." He paused. "If they are not, they are there," Wren said. "I sent the first envelope in October of 1880, the last in March of 1883. Each is sealed with wax marked with a notation that the contents are not to be opened except in the presence of a federal officer. The envelopes are intact. Reverend Wode keeps things carefully. I have known him since I was a child." Sable looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded once. "There is one additional matter," he said, looking at Ledger. "A federal marshal named Fletcher Dodd has filed a complaint against you for interference with a lawful detainment." He looked at him steadily. "Tell me about that." Ledger met his gaze. "Dodd produced a document he called a warrant. I asked to see it. He declined. He then struck me twice with a pistol grip in front of 2 of his own men." Sable observed the side of his face. "So I observe." He made a note. "And the warrant itself, I don't believe it was issued by any court with proper authority," Ledger said. "I believe it was prepared by someone with access to the correct paper and seal and the incorrect jurisdiction." Sable set down his pen. "That is a significant allegation regarding a serving federal marshal." "Yes," Ledger said. "It is." "Is the authorization for Dodd's commission addressed in the materials you preserved?" Sable asked Wren. "There is a letter," she said, dated March of 1880, from Edmund Crane to a deputy administrator in the Territorial Appointments Office. It discusses facilitation of a federal marshal's commission for an individual described as a trusted operational associate and specifies that the commission should be processed through a secondary channel to avoid standard review. The name Fletcher Dodd appears in the margin written in a different hand from the letter's body. Sable looked at her for a sustained moment. "You have a remarkable memory," he said. "I was given excellent training in records management," Wren said, "and a great deal of time in which to apply it to a subject that mattered." Something moved in Sable's expression, not quite humor, but the recognition of irony by a man who appreciated it in all its forms. "You will both remain in Helena until the riders return," he said, standing. "You will have a deputy outside your doors, and you will not move through this town alone. Either of you." He looked at Ledger specifically on that last point. I am placing you under federal protection, which is not a suggestion. Understood, Ledger said. Good. Sable moved to the door, then stopped without turning. Mr. Hurst, your father's property acquisition, was it originally financed through a bank in this territory? The Harrow Creek Territorial Bank, Ledger said. Branch manager at the time was a man named Pollard. Sable nodded once and went out. They were given rooms on the second floor of a boarding house 2 streets from the courthouse, with a deputy posted at the bottom of the stairs. The doctor visited Ledger again and applied a cold compress and repeated his recommendation about rest, and Ledger submitted to this with the resignation of a man conserving energy for what came next. That evening, Wren knocked on his door and came in without waiting for an invitation, which was by now simply how she entered rooms. She sat in the chair near the window and looked out at the main street below. He's here, she said. Ledger looked at her. Edmund Crane arrived in Helena this morning by private coach. She paused. I saw the livery from the courthouse steps while I was waiting for you. Dark green with brass fittings, craneland and rail. He does not run. That is important to understand about him. When a situation requires his attention, he comes to it rather than waiting. He considers waiting a form of submission. Ledger leaned back carefully against the headboard. He's already moved against us with the governor. What does he do next? He attempts to speak to me, she said, before the riders return with the materials. He will try to make an offer or a threat in the window between now and when the evidence becomes part of the official federal record. He has done this before, resolved situations in the gap between exposure and documentation. He is very good at it. You're not speaking to him alone. She looked at him with the expression she used when he said something she had already determined. I know that, she said. He'll approach through an intermediary first, Ledger said. Someone he can claim is neutral, to feel out whether you can still be settled. Wren nodded. By tomorrow morning, when the intermediary reports that I cannot be settled, he will try to apply pressure on Sable through the governor's office. And when that fails, she stopped. What Ledger said. She was quiet for a moment. My father has never actually lost, she said. Not once. In 30 years of operating in this territory, every person who has moved against him has either been bought or broken or has simply disappeared from relevance. She looked at her hands in her lap. I need you to understand that I am not unaware of the magnitude of what we are attempting. I understand the magnitude, Ledger said. She looked at him. I know you do, she said. I wanted to say it out loud anyway, because we are past the point where pretending things are simpler than they are serves any purpose. Ledger held her gaze. We have his own records, he said. In his own hand, through his own subsidiaries, documenting his own operations, held by people who have had them for 3 years and have no connection to either of us. He paused. That is not a situation he has faced before, because this is the first time someone inside the operation built the case instead of someone outside it trying to break in. Wren looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, My father taught me to think in terms of contingencies. He always said the difference between success and failure was not intelligence or resources. It was the number of contingencies you had prepared for. Ledger nodded. I prepared for this one for 3 years, she said. I prepared for the possibility that I would not survive to present the evidence myself. I prepared for the possibility that one of the caches would be discovered. I prepared for the possibility that the federal court would be compromised. She paused. I did not prepare for Ledger Hurst. He looked at her. I did not prepare for someone who would say 2 words and mean them, she said, without calculation, without wanting anything in return for them. The room was quiet. The sounds of Helena's evening came through the window, a wagon somewhere, men talking outside a saloon 2 streets over. The ordinary sounds of a town that did not know what was being decided 2 streets away in the opposite direction. Ledger said, Get some sleep. Tomorrow is going to require everything we have. She nodded and stood. At the door, she stopped. Ledger, she said. He looked at her. Thank you, she said. Not for the horses, for the 2 words. She went out and pulled the door closed behind her. In the morning, Edmund Crane found Ledger first. Ledger was walking from the boarding house to the courthouse for the morning testimony session when he turned a corner on the main street and stopped. Crane was standing on the sidewalk outside the land registry office 20 feet ahead alone. No hired men visible. No Dodd. He was looking directly at Ledger with the calm, measured expression of a man who had arranged this particular encounter and was not in any way surprised by it. He was 61 years old and looked like what he was, a man who had spent 4 decades accumulating power through intelligence, patience, and the careful, strategic application of force to other people's vulnerabilities. He was not physically imposing. He was of medium height and slim build, dressed in a dark coat that was quietly expensive with gray hair and eyes that were a clear, pale gray, that matched the coat so precisely it seemed intentional. He looked like a banker. He looked like a judge. He looked like the kind of man who did not need to look dangerous because the danger was so thoroughly established that the appearance of it had become redundant. He looked, Ledger thought, exactly like a man who had never expected to be standing on a public street in Helena, facing the son of James Hurst. "Mr. Hurst," Crane said. His voice was moderate and entirely controlled. "I believe we should speak." "I don't believe we should," Ledger said. He did not stop walking toward him. Crane did not move from the sidewalk. "A moment of your time," he said. "That is all I am asking." Ledger stopped 3 feet from him. He looked at Crane the way he had once looked at men in interview rooms with the particular attention of someone reading beneath the surface of what was being presented. "You came all this way to ask for a moment of my time," Ledger said. "I came to make a reasonable offer," Crane said. "The situation you have placed yourself in is more complicated than you may understand. My daughter is not well. She has not been well for some time. The documents she believes she possesses." "She doesn't believe she possesses them," Ledger said. "She does possess them, in 3 locations, and Judge Sable's riders picked them up yesterday." Something happened in Crane's eyes. A very small contraction, like a pupil adjusting to a change in light. He covered it immediately, but Ledger had been watching for it, and he saw it. "This does not have to be a matter for the courts," Crane said, and his voice was still entirely controlled. "There are people in this territory who have been harmed by business practices that, in retrospect, were too aggressive. I am prepared to offer restitution. Significant restitution. To affected parties, including—" "My father is dead," Ledger said. Crane stopped. "He died in December of 1878, Ledger said, "in a manner that your own records may have something to say about." He held Crane's gaze without blinking. "So the offer of restitution doesn't quite reach to what this situation actually is, does it?" Crane looked at him for a long moment. The controlled expression did not change, but something behind it had shifted, the almost imperceptible adjustment of a man recalculating the position he thought he occupied. "You are making a serious mistake," Crane said quietly. "No," Ledger said. "Your mistake was 1878. He took a step back to create distance. Everything since then has been the consequence arriving." He walked past Crane and continued to the courthouse. He did not look back. He did not need to. The riders returned that afternoon. All 3 of them, each carrying a sealed package that had been in their respective locations for periods, ranging from 3 months to 3 years. The packages were brought to Judge Sable's chambers, where they were opened in the presence of Sable, his clerk, Ledger Wren, and 2 additional witnesses that Sable had summoned from the territorial attorney's office. Wren sat very still while the packages were opened. She had not seen the contents since she sent them. She had been carrying them in her memory for 3 years, but there was something in seeing the physical papers, the actual pages, her own handwriting on the covering letters. The documents she had copied by lamplight in the office her father had trusted her to manage, that was different from memory. More final, more real. Sable read in silence for a long time. His clerk took notes. The territorial attorneys conferred quietly in the corner. Outside, through the stone walls, Helena continued its ordinary day without any awareness of what was being read in that room. Finally, Sable set down the last document and looked across the desk. "Miss Voss," he said, "I have been on this bench for 11 years. He paused. "In that time, I have seen a significant number of attempts to use the legal system for purposes it was not designed to serve." He looked at the papers before him. "What I have in front of me is among the most comprehensive documentation of sustained criminal fraud I have encountered in this jurisdiction." Wren said nothing. Sable looked at Ledger. "The property acquisition of James Hurst Copper Ridge, 1878, is represented here in 3 separate documents." He paused. "There is also a payment record that I will be referring to the Territorial Medical Examiner's office for further review." Ledger received this without expression. He had been prepared for it since the afternoon in the canyon when Wren had told him, choosing her words with that careful precision she brought to everything that mattered. He was prepared for it, and it still landed with weight the way things do when you have known them intellectually but not yet experienced them as fully real. He nodded once. Sable stood. He did not make announcements. He simply began the process, signing documents, directing his clerk, sending word to the Federal Marshal's central office in Denver that Fletcher Dodd's commission was under immediate review, pending investigation of its authorization. He sent a response to the governor's office declining the petition to limit jurisdiction with a 3-page explanation of his reasoning that was not written in language designed to be easily ignored. And he sent 2 deputies to the hotel where Edmund Crane was staying. The arrest happened at 4 in the afternoon on the main street of Helena, in full view of the ordinary Thursday traffic of a territorial capital. Crane came out of his hotel with 2 deputies on either side of him and stopped on the sidewalk. He looked at the street at the people who had stopped to watch at the freight drivers and the clerks and the women with parcels who had paused in their Thursday to observe something they did not fully understand but could feel the weight of. He looked at all of it with the expression of a man performing a final calculation and arriving at a result he had not expected and could not immediately accommodate. He did not struggle. He did not make a speech. He allowed the deputies to place the restraints on his wrists with the contained dignity of a man who had decided that whatever came next, he would face it without giving anyone the satisfaction of seeing him diminished in public. But for just a moment, as the deputies turned him toward the courthouse, his eyes found Ledger standing on the opposite sidewalk. Ledger did not look away. Crane looked at him for 3 seconds. Then he looked away first, and the deputies walked him down the street, and the crowd that had gathered on both sides of the sidewalk was very quiet, in the way that crowds are quiet when they are witnessing something they will describe for the rest of their lives. Fletcher Dodd was taken into custody the same afternoon by federal deputies who rode out to meet him on the Helena Road. He surrendered his badge and his sidearm without resistance, which surprised no one who had considered the mathematics of his situation carefully. Denton Marlowe was arrested in Harrow Creek 2 days later on charges that would eventually include conspiracy fraud and unlawful detainment. The public hearing was held 4 days after the arrest in the largest room the Helena courthouse possessed, which was not large enough. People had come from across the territory. Ranchers and farmers and miners and the widows of men who had lost properties in ways they had never been able to explain or prove. They filled the room and the hallway outside the room and stood on the sidewalk beyond, and the clerk had to leave the doors open so that the people on the sidewalk could hear, and even then the crowd extended beyond earshot and had to receive the proceedings second-hand from those closer to the doors. Wren Voss stood before them all. She stood without notes, with her hands at her sides, in the same dress that had been worn and mended and worn again through 4 days of mountain riding, and she was the steadiest thing in the room. My father built Crane Land and Rail through a combination of legitimate business and systematic fraud, she said. The fraud was not incidental to the business. It was structural. It was planned. It was executed through a series of subsidiary companies designed specifically to insulate his personal signature from the operational decisions he authorized. She spoke for 2 hours. She named the subsidiary companies. She named the bank officers who had been paid to accelerate debt. She named the surveyors who had moved markers. She named the veterinarians and the doctors who had recorded causes of death that were consistent with what they had been paid to record. She named 63 properties. She named 63 families. The room was absolutely silent while she spoke, the particular silence of a large group of people receiving information that rearranges something fundamental about how they understand their own history. Not silence from lack of response, but silence from the magnitude of response too large to be expressed in sound. When she reached the 41st name, a homestead in Lincoln County, a husband and wife and 3 children, a family she had never met, but whose paperwork she had processed in 1880 on an autumn afternoon and then gone home and sat in her room. Her voice remained steady and even. It had been steady through 40 names, and it remained steady through the 41st and the 42nd and all the names that followed. When she reached the 59th name, she paused. James Hurst, she said. Copper Ridge, Colorado, winter of 1878. In the back of the room, Ledger sat in the last row with his hat in his hands. The left side of his face was still swollen, the bruising gone to dark yellow and green at the edges. He was looking at the floor. He heard his father's name in her voice, said with the same precision and weight she gave every name, every family, every piece of land that had been taken by a man who had calculated that other people's losses were the most efficient route to his own accumulation. He heard his father's name stated as a fact in a federal courtroom in front of a room full of people entered into the official record of a territory that had failed to protect what it should have protected. He did not wipe his eyes. He sat still and let the fact of it land where it needed to land, in the place he had been protecting for 5 years, the place where his father's apology lived and where it had never belonged. James Hurst had nothing to apologize for. It was in the record now. When Wren finished speaking, the room remained silent for a long moment. Then a man near the front stood up, an older rancher with weathered hands and a face that had been in the sun for 40 years. And he did not say anything. He simply stood. And then the woman next to him stood. And then the people around them. And the standing moved through the room in a slow wave, not like applause, not like celebration, but like the collective physical expression of a group of people choosing to be upright rather than diminished. Sable let it run for 30 seconds. Then he brought the gavel down once, and the room resettled, and the process of justice, slow, imperfect, and real, continued its work. The legal proceedings that followed took months. Federal auditors reconstructed the full financial architecture of Crane Land and Rail, tracing every subsidiary, every shell account, every payment that had passed through the system Wren had documented. They found more than she had been able to copy: additional properties, additional payments, additional names. Her 3 years of preparation had provided the skeleton. The investigation added the rest. 63 families had been documented in her testimony. The full investigation identified 91. Restitution funds were established through the seizure of Crane Land and Rail assets. The process of returning land was slow and complicated, and not every case could be fully resolved. Some properties had changed hands multiple times. Some families had scattered. Some of the losses were too old and too tangled to fully unwind. But the fund was real, and the disbursements were real, and for many of the families involved, the formal acknowledgement that what had happened to them was documented, official, and criminal was something they had not expected to receive and did not know how to fully express their response to. Fletcher Dodd's federal marshal's commission was formally revoked, and he was charged with abuse of office conspiracy and unlawful detainment. He entered into a cooperation agreement with the federal prosecutor's office in exchange for reduced charges, and the information he provided accelerated the investigation of the subsidiary network considerably. Edmund Crane was held in the Helena County Jail throughout the proceedings. He did not request bail. He did not make public statements. He met with his lawyers every day, and he read whatever documents they brought him, and he was in every observable way the same controlled, precise, administratively minded man he had always been. Except that the administration he was now attending to was the management of his own legal exposure rather than the expansion of a criminal empire. He was ultimately convicted on 11 federal counts, including fraud conspiracy, and 3 counts relating to the procurement of false official documents. The sentencing was conducted by Judge Orrin Sable, who had declined 2 appointments to higher courts rather than leave the territory where he had spent his career and who sentenced Edmund Crane to 14 years in the federal penitentiary with a specificity and thoroughness that suggested he had given the matter considerable thought. In the hallway outside the courtroom after the sentencing, Wren stood alone for a moment before Ledger found her. She was looking at nothing in particular, at the stone wall of the hallway, at the ordinary institutional facts of a corridor in a federal building. She looked tired in a way she had not allowed herself to look during the preceding months, when there had always been the next testimony session, the next document review, the next meeting with Sable's office. Ledger stood beside her. Neither of them spoke for a while. "Is it what you expected?" he asked eventually. She considered this seriously. "It is what I planned for," she said. "Whether I expected it?" She stopped. "I planned for this outcome for 3 years," she said. "But planning for something and believing it will actually happen are different things. At some point during those 3 years, I stopped being certain it would happen and simply continued doing the work because the work was what I had to do, regardless of the outcome." She was quiet for a moment. "I kept thinking about that family in Lincoln County," she said. "The husband and wife and 3 children. I don't know what happened to them after they left their homestead. I don't know where they went or whether they survived the first winter or whether there are children today who grew up without knowing why their parents lost what they lost." She paused. "The record says what happened to them. The fund may return something to them, but I cannot return the years." "No," Ledger said. "You can't return the years." She turned and looked at him. He looked back. The hallway was empty around them, the ordinary institutional quiet of a building between events. "What you can do," Ledger said, "is make sure the record is accurate, so that whatever happened, it happened in the light, where it can be seen." Wren looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded once the way she nodded when she had received something and confirmed its receipt. They walked out of the courthouse and into the afternoon light of a Helena. October, where the air had the particular sharpness of the high country and autumn cold at the edges. Brilliant in the center, the mountains to the north already showing white at the peaks. 2 months later, Ledger Hurst drove his wagon back to Copper Ridge on a morning when the first real cold of winter was moving down out of the northern hills. The restitution process had returned a portion of the original Hurst property to him. Not all of it. Not the parcels that had changed hands too many times to unwind, but the core of it, the 40 acres his father had started with, and the cabin that still stood on the eastern edge. He had spent the previous weeks in Helena, completing testimony and signing documents and attending the procedural sessions that the legal process required. And he had done all of it with the patient attention of a man who understood that this particular kind of work did not move at the speed of horses on a mountain trail. It moved at the speed of institutions, which was slower but more permanent. Wren had been beside him through most of it. She had given her own testimony in multiple sessions, answered the federal auditor's questions about specific documents and specific transactions, provided context for records that required explanation, and maintained throughout all of it the same steady, precise, unhurried quality of attention that she had brought to everything from the moment she had stopped pretending she couldn't speak. She had also, in the evenings after the proceedings, sat at the table in the boarding house common room and read or written letters, or simply been present in the quiet way she was present, taking up exactly the space she occupied, neither more nor less, and not apologizing for either. They had not discussed what came next. There had not been time, and there had not been the right moment, and Ledger had come to understand that with Wren Voss, the right moment was the one that arrived naturally, rather than the one you tried to arrange. The wagon came over the last rise before the ranch, and the property spread out below in the low winter light. The house, the rebuilt corral, the barn with its corrected list, the fence lines that she had started repairing on the morning of the second day. The south pasture was pale and dry in the November cold, but the cattle were there, moved down from the summer pasture, and looking sound and well-fed from Aldous Pruitt's careful management through the months of Ledger's absence. He stopped the wagon at the gate. Wren sat beside him on the bench. The property was quiet in the way that land is quiet in early winter. The particular stillness of a place that is resting between seasons, gathering itself for what comes next. Ledger looked out over the 40 acres that his father had started with. He thought about the morning in 1863 when James Hurst had arrived on this land with a wagon and a wife and the particular kind of faith that young men have before the world has had sufficient time to test it. He thought about 20 years of work and the winter that had ended it and the apology that had not been owed. The apology was not owed, and now there was a federal record that said so. He looked at his hands on the reins. Working hands. The hands of a man who had spent 4 years trying to build something on the foundation of a loss he had not fully understood and who now understood it and who had the foundation back. He became aware that Wren was watching him. He looked over at her. "He was thinking about your father," she said. It was not a question. "Yes," Ledger said. She was quiet for a moment, looking out over the pale pasture and the fence lines she had started and the barn with its corrected list. He used to say something, Ledger said, every evening when the account books didn't balance the way he needed them to. He'd close the ledger and say it. What did he say? Ledger looked at the land his father had built from raw ground. "Tomorrow, we'll find a way." Wren was still beside him, looking at the same pasture, the same fence lines, the same pale winter light coming at a low angle off the hills. "He was right," she said. Ledger looked at her. She was looking at the ranch, at the rebuilt corral and the straightened barn, and the cattle in the south field, and the 40 acres that were his father's, and were now his, and would be whatever came after his. "He was right," she said again. "You found the way." It took longer than he thought it would, but he was right. Ledger held her gaze for a moment, then he looked back at the ranch. "You staying," he said. She had told Judge Sable that the Copper Ridge address was her permanent contact for legal correspondence related to the ongoing proceedings. She had given that address in October, 2 months ago, and had been giving it in every subsequent communication since. She had given it without being asked, and without discussing it with Ledger, and without any apparent uncertainty about whether it was the correct address to give. "I already told the court," she said. "This is my address of record." She looked at him. The corner of her mouth moved in the way it had been moving occasionally and briefly since the morning she had first spoken to him beside a corral fence in the early summer light. Not quite a smile, but the thing that a smile was made of. "I think that answers the question," she said. Ledger looked at her for one more moment. Then he clicked the reins, and the wagon rolled forward through the gate and onto the land that had been stolen and was now returned. And behind them the gate swung closed with the particular solid sound of something settling back into its proper place. The winter light lay long and level across Copper Ridge. The cattle moved slowly in the south field. Somewhere in the hills to the north, the first snow of the season was gathering itself patient and inevitable the way things gathered themselves in this country, without hurry, without announcement, simply becoming real. In the way that all enduring things eventually became real. On the land that James Hurst had built and lost, and that his son had spent 5 years rebuilding, without knowing why it had been taken. 2 people sat on a wagon bench in the last of the afternoon light, and neither of them needed to say anything else.